Thanks, John. So, in fact, I have changed things around quite a bit to focus more on basic questions about network stability associated with the isostatic point that we heard a lot about from Tom already on Monday evening. So, in fact, there's going to be some connection with that work that I'll mention along the way. In fact, including one collaboration along the way with Tom Lubinsky and his former postdoc, Xiaoming Mao, who's now in Michigan. So the starting point, though, is this beautiful soft matter system, a living cell. And as many of you will know, probably don't need to point this out at all, but inside here one has beautiful and complex multi-component structures and machinery that generate forces within that, those structures. I'll say a little bit more about this as I go along, but the point is one already has rich elastic properties of networks of biopolymers, and when you turn those active by molecular motors, the kinds of things that we have heard about in a couple of talks, for instance, on Tuesday by Julia and Zvonimir, but I'm sure we'll hear much more, even very shortly, actually. When you turn these systems active, of course, the system goes out of equilibrium, and that's one of the reasons these systems are interesting. But I want to focus primarily on an interesting mechanical state of these networks that one can think of as marginal. It is close to, or in some cases below, the isostatic point of at which stability appears or disappears, depending on whether the system goes more or less connected. And it's that point, actually, which winds up being a highly responsive state of matter. And so what motor activity does there is actually quite interesting. Along the way, I'll get to looking at also at thermal fluctuations in the system. I should warn you at the outset, I'm going to be focusing exclusively on mechanical athermal aspects, even though some things will start sounding a little bit like temperature, maybe. And then finally, if there's time, I'd like to point out how motors can actually control, or motor activity can actually control and drive the system to this marginal state, even from a well-connected state. Along the way, I'll be mentioning a number of collaborations. Not so much in this talk on the experimental side, but we've enjoyed many fruitful collaborations with colleagues like Dave Waits, Christoph Schmidt, and Gijsje Koenderink and Paul Janmy over the years. I'll mention, I think, only really one collaboration with Gijsje Koenderink's group toward the end. I'll focus instead more on the theoretical aspects with several members of my group I'll be mentioning along the way. And as I already indicated, also with external colleagues like Tom Lubinsky and Kay Storm. So here's the system. It is a multi-component structure which is filamentous in nature, or largely, at least the structure I want to focus on is, composed of at least three kinds of structural elements, two of which are fluorescently labeled here in green and red, microtubules and actin. One also has a rich class of, actually very varied class of intermediate filaments that form networks as well. And the point is one has this sort of structural idea of filamentous proteins, in many cases rather stiff to bending, at both the intracellular and extracellular level. So many of the same principles apply at a scale larger than a single cell in the in intracellular, extracellular matrices, or the space, if you like, between cells, or what holds cells together. In the case of collagen, for instance. This happens to be fibrin. And so immediately, in thinking about these systems, one is faced with very basic questions about what the origin of elasticity is in these systems, what's the nature of the elastic properties, turn out to be highly nonlinear, as many people will know. I won't be focusing too much on that. They are indeed out of equilibrium, as I'll be indicating. And, well, just to warn you at the outset, be careful thinking of anything we've learned from flexible polymers in this context. There are very big differences in the behavior of these systems and, let's say, maybe more familiar soft matter systems. Okay, so let me begin with very old but beautiful ideas that are just shy of 150 years old now. Going back to Maxwell, we heard about this from Tom, as I said. I have a less historically accurate picture of a bridge here, but nevertheless, the kind of structure that Maxwell was worried about. And the question was, what are the minimum conditions for stability? I won't belabor this point because most of us have seen it already on Monday, but let me just remind you that the basic idea here is what Maxwell was concerned with was the stability of these networks. And if I look at the nodes of the network indicated in red, they have d degrees of freedom in d dimensions. So in this two-dimensional picture, they can move up and down and sideways, so two degrees of freedom. And this is actually just a marginal structure that I've sketched here. Because if I have z neighbors, or z, depending on where you come from, I have a hard time adjusting to that. Even in the Netherlands, it should be z. But anyway, so one has some number of neighbors. And if that number is just twice the number of dimensions, one has a marginally stable structure. The factor of 2 comes from the fact that each one of these springs, and what I have in mind are just simply Hookean springs, as in Maxwell's original picture. Each one of these springs it provides one constraint, but it has to sort of half constrain on average two nodes. That's where the factor of 2 comes from. So this system is marginally stable. So in 2 dimensions, 4 neighbors are enough. And anything more just increases the rigidity of the system a little bit up to some point where it becomes relatively insensitive. But what's interesting is that the loss of stability in the other direction is continuous. If you start to remove these constraints, it's not just that at some point the system becomes floppy and ceases to have a shear modulus. It does so in a continuous fashion. That's important for the story as we go along. But let's return to the systems that motivated at least our thinking about this old question here, in spite of the fact that the connection between the two may not seem so obvious. But if you look at these images, this is going from the largest scale collagen down to smaller scale networks. This is an example of an intermediate filament network inside a cell. The typical structure here consists of 2 filamentous proteins crossing at one point with maybe a cross-linking protein holding them together there. You also have, especially in the case of collagen, branching. So that would be a 3-fold connection. Also here in the case of intermediate filaments as well. Now, those systems are therefore subisostatic. So Maxwell would have said they shouldn't be stable. And so the basic question I want to get to is, in looking at several different aspects of this, how can one have stability below the isostatic point? One can by a number of effects. And of course, one of the first I want to look at, by way of example, is one of the things that, of course, Maxwell wasn't thinking of in the case of structures like bridges and so on, that is relevant for, or at least doesn't seem to have been thinking about, maybe that's a better way to put it, but that is very relevant to these systems here, namely the rigidity of these fibers to bending. That's an additional constraint. I will not take you through a corresponding estimate of the corresponding isostatic point because it's much more complicated if you add in bending. Okay, so this simple mean field argument here is remarkably good. It's not exact. There's a percent or so shift in this point if you look at disordered networks, disordered spring networks even. Things get much harder if you add in bending. But clearly that's a interaction or an energy and a stabilizing effect which is left out in this argument and can indeed stabilize biopolymer networks. Now, the interesting point, though, or one interesting point worth emphasizing, is that would actually suggest that networks like collagen, actin, fibrin, intermediate filaments shouldn't have any stability at all without their bending rigidity. That would suggest that their macroscopic shear modulus would, for instance, be proportional to that bending rigidity. That's a subtle question. It's not always true. So there are regimes which would appear to violate Maxwell, this Maxwell counting, in the sense that you can have a sub-isostatic local connectivity, but as long as you have any finite bend to modulus at all, the system is rigid and entirely stretch-dominated, i.e. the deformation takes the form of stretching like these Hookean springs. That's a subtle and interesting point. Anyway, let me begin with the effect of bending to emphasize the critical nature of this transition at the isostatic point. So what's shown here in both 2D and 3D, and this is from simulations. I'll show you a mean field result in a moment. But what's shown here in both 2D and 3D are diluted lattice systems. They're disordered structures. And down here in red, the vertical dashed lines, are the corresponding isostatic points according to Maxwell, where these networks would cease to have a shear modulus. So there's no line here that shows this explicitly for two reasons. I didn't just happen to put up a zero bending system. It turns out also that you wouldn't see such a sharp transition because of finite size effects. But in the limit of a large system, there would be a very clear, continuous decrease in the shear modulus here towards zero. So what's plotted is the shear modulus versus connectivity or the probability of occupying a bond, equivalently. Now, on the left-hand side, then, you have the subisostatic networks, and they are stable. They do have finite shear moduli in proportion to the bending rigidity, at least if we're far enough from this Maxwell isostatic point. Now, if you look at one of these curves here, say this blue one, I want to make an analogy to a completely different system, namely a magnet as a function of temperature, ferromagnet. So the way to think about this Maxwell isostatic point is to think of taking the system and diluting a stable structure and having a shear modulus vanish at the isostatic point in a way like a ferromagnet loses its magnetization as you increase temperature in a continuous fashion. In fact, if I turn on a field, I get, of course, non-zero magnetization everywhere. And it's one of these finite field curves that I want to make an analogy with over here. So the basic idea, again, just because I'll need this again, is as a function of temperature, I have some order parameter, magnetization here, which vanishes continuously. And if I look at what I can think of as a stabilizing field, i.e. turn on a magnetic field which creates an ordered state, then I get a continuous variation and a non-zero magnetization. And yet, nevertheless, in the vicinity of the critical point, or Curie temperature, I have signatures of that critical behavior, including, and here's the most interesting one for our purposes, a susceptibility which diverges at that point. Now, I'm talking about mechanical systems. So it's mechanical susceptibility that we'll be looking at. And mechanical susceptibility would be like a responsiveness, if you like, of a material. So we're talking about materials that become highly responsive near this marginal point. Yes?
E is the bending then?
Aha, okay. So the analogy is not obvious, but I'm going to be going through several examples of stabilizing effects which I can think of as fields, or coupling constants. And the slightly better way to think about this is actually in terms of what's called critical crossover, where it's actually a coupling constant which takes the system from one critical behavior to another. There's a lower bending dominated rigidity percolation point. So a slightly better analogy would be to talk about going from, let's say, a Heisenberg model to an Ising model by adding in preference for alignment along one axis. Yes?
The region in the blue curve, there's a loss of convexity there. Does that lead to instability?
This is not as a function of strain. This is connectivity. So, okay, yeah. So the system, actually these systems have a linear elastic modulus. They will also be nonlinear in their response, I should say, but they strictly stiffen. Question?
This comment, PB, is that obtained by a similar argument to the Maxwell argument, but including bending modes?
Oh, yeah, that's a long story. It's much tougher, and you can go through a mean field argument. It doesn't work as well as the Maxwell one, not too surprisingly. But there are good estimates for this.
You mean not surprisingly because Maxwell was a really smart guy?
Well, well, yes, that, and also it is a more complex problem. Okay, so it's basically this analogy that is the reason for pointing this out. And maybe it helps if I flip this phase diagram around, so they plot it versus 1 over t. The ordered phase, if you like, is the high connectivity phase or low temperature phase. Okay, so just to point out one example of a number of pieces of evidence that sort of flesh out this analogy with critical phenomena, let me show you some results of simulation and also a mean field calculation, looking at the shear modulus as a function of connectivity and my field-like quantity, which is bending in this case, but it's a stabilizing effect. And as I said, this is slightly better to think of this as critical crossover, but in fact, you might recognize this kind of expression from Whittem scaling, expressing the magnetization as a function of distance from the critical temperature. This would be delta T here. And then this exponent would, in a mean field case, be 1/2. And then the function that appears here would then be a function of field divided by distance from the temperature, distance from the critical temperature to some power. And the point about this sort of a scaling ansatz is it shows with a collection of data from different samples just how well this picture works. And what you see is a collapse of many different systems, both in 2D and 3D, with slightly different exponents, to a picture where I have what's the low temperature ordered phase branch here. That's the system which is stable in the absence of any bending rigidity. That's the highly connected structure, the system above the isostatic point. And down here, shear moduli proportional, in this case, to the bending rigidity. There's also a critical region. And that's something which Tom Lubinsky and his postdoc Xiaoming Mao have calculated, and that's shown on the right here. And what you see is a nice qualitative analogy between these two, but quantitatively there's some interesting differences. In particular, the exponents are different. And what that means is we have an example of breakdown of mean field here. This is, again, an athermal system, however. Okay, so this is one example of how systems can be stabilized below the isostatic point, nevertheless showing evidence of the criticality associated, and in particular, diverging susceptibility and fluctuations at that critical point. Now, the nature of the fluctuations in this case is not so obvious. They're not thermal fluctuations. This is an athermal system. The fluctuations take the form of non-uniform strain in the system, so-called non-affine deformations. But let me turn now to what happens when you add stresses to this picture. First of all, external, but eventually I want to get to looking at motor stresses of this kind. So I guess we didn't see this movie necessarily on Tuesday, but there was a picture of a movie in Julia's talk. That I don't think she ran the actual movie, but showing something like this. This is a cartoon of a kinesin motor protein moving on a microtubule. One has all sorts of these active processes with different kinds of motors in a cell. This kind of process here tends to be used for transport. So just to show you this, this is a collection of microtubules on a surface with fluorescently labeled cargoes being transported around by kinesin motors. Well, if you look at this anytime, you'll obviously see that we're not looking at Brownian motion of the green dots. They're being actively transported in a sort of highway system. Now, that's not the kind of motor activity I want to really look at, but it's probably the first time one runs across this sort of thing. In this motion, forces are generated. It's an athermal non-equilibrium system. Energy is being consumed. But at the macroscopic level, or the largest scale, let's say, of a single cell, stresses are generated by a different kind of motor activity, which is more muscle-like, in fact, even involving some of the same components. And a sketch is over here, a collection of myosin motors attached to more than one actin filament and generate relative sliding between the two, generating stresses between points in the network. These stresses actually, microscopically, can be thought of to some extent as a balanced force pair, or dipole, as I've indicated in green here. But nevertheless, it introduces contractile stresses in an elastic network, in a, let's say, a network which can be elastic over some time regime. And so it's the effect of these stresses that I want to look at. There's a number of reasons why these have been interesting in recent years. One point here, just shown from work by Gijs Kunderink and Dave Waits, just shows that you can take this kind of motor and add it to an elastic network in the elastic cross-linked regime for the actin, as it turns out. And you'll find that it actually stiffens the network substantially by, well, 2 orders of magnitude or so. And this comes about, or can be understood, in terms of the nonlinear, specifically strain or stress stiffening response of these networks, where internal stresses have been added, thereby stiffening them. Okay, so that's one of the reasons for looking at the effect of motor activity. But I want to go back to that isostatic point, the point of limited stability or marginal stability, and ask what happens when you add stress or strain into this picture. And this actually goes back to some beautiful work of people like Shlomo Alexander and others years ago, asking questions about stress or strain stabilized networks. And the point here is, if you look at this vertical axis, it represents the connectivity of the network. So for a highly connected state, one has a rigid system, and below the isostatic point, one has a floppy system. So what happens if you add strain to this picture? Well, one can see the kind of thing that might happen just by playing with string and fishnets and things like that. If you take a floppy network and simply stretch it out, straining it, obviously, in this case, well, almost uniform expansion, it actually goes rigid. Now, in this particular case, it's a little trivial because all I've done is sort of align filaments. But the basic picture does apply even in a random system. What happens is this threshold shifts down. So even at a lower level of connectivity, one can have a stable system if you put it under strain. And what that suggests is, by adding external macroscopic strain or stress, or internal force generation, one can actually transition across this line, going from a floppy system to a rigid system without any change in the network connectivity or even the amount of polymer present. And it's that picture I want to look at. So here's a movie showing more or less just what I indicated with the little fishnet there. What I've done is I've simply taken a random network, a original triangular network with cut bonds, and stretched it at the boundaries, and then kept the picture in the same field of view, so it wasn't actually expanding, the image wasn't actually expanding. But what I hope you see is that the network starts to disorder. If you were looking closely, you might have actually recognized that it was disordering most right before the point where I stopped. That actually is an example of diverging fluctuations. So this plot down here is either of fluctuations or susceptibility. So the system is actually developing a non-uniform strain field, which I can think of as fluctuations, maximally right before the point where it goes stable. That's what happens now. So turning the movie back on again, you see that forces shown in red start propagating across the system. Before that, the system was entirely floppy. Now, this is just a simple cartoon, of course, just to illustrate a point. But what's interesting is that transition across this boundary remains second order, complete with diverging fluctuations and susceptibility. So the system is highly responsive mechanically near this boundary. So if you like, this second order point here has been stretched out into a line of second order points. Yes?
I can sort of understand this when you strain the system, but I don't understand how this works if you apply a fixed stress. If you're on the floppy side, so there's no elasticity,
yes,
and you apply stress, why doesn't it immediately strain right out to the point where it starts resisting?
It will. So there's a reason why. Okay, so, yeah, sorry, I probably shouldn't have put stress here in this original picture. This is a picture appropriate for strain. What the better way to think about it in terms of stress would be this. So as a function of stress, I just get a line like that.
Right.
Because, of course, the system can't support any stress until it can bear a load across the network. Yeah, good point. So I'm being a little less than careful about my axis here.
This is exactly the picture.
Yeah. Okay, so now, if one looks at that now in a little bit more the limit I really had in mind, which is internal motor activity, what happens is, and there's actually a good mean field description that Nisha Scheinman has worked out for this, but if I have no linear shear modulus to begin with, obviously I'm talking about a nonlinear effect if I'm getting a modulus which depends on stress. So if this term goes away, as it will below the isostatic point, and if I'm dealing with at least small stress, this term here will dominate. And what it amounts to is a statement, well, it looks really like, well, again, pushing an analogy which shouldn't be pushed too far, this sort of looks like magnetization is field times susceptibility.
Delta gamma is Z minus CC?
So delta gamma is a measure of either two things, susceptibility or fluctuations. It is something which diverges. So actually, this picture shows right here, it diverges at this transition. Think of it as susceptibility. And I'll show another plot of it here in a moment. But what's interesting is this term right here gives, if you now add motor activity, now I'm skipping over a lot of details, but what really is done here is to add a random distribution of force dipoles into the network, i.e. representing contractile stresses. And as a function of motor density, now this transition is not along this line. There is a finite threshold of motor density which is required to do this. But you transition to a stable or rigid state in such a way that the shear modulus actually goes sublinearly with stress, corresponding to a susceptibility which actually diverges at 0 stress, and then stress takes the system away from the critical point, just like magnetic field would take a ferromagnet away from the critical point. And so this, I didn't actually give the numbers here, but this exponent here is about 0.8, and this is minus 0.2. So again, the system is highly, even infinitely, you could say, responsive right at this transition where it goes stable.
How do things vary with system size?
Yes. So we studied system size dependence and finite size scaling a lot in the context of the first system I mentioned with bending, and all of the usual aspects of ordinary critical phenomena go through, including you can extract from the finite size scaling the new exponent, if you like, the correlation length exponent. And it diverges with a non-mean field exponent. We haven't done that so much here because of, well, we're looking at the, that finite size scaling is usually done in the absence of a field. And it's much easier to do in that context. It's a little bit tougher with now adding a field into it. But maybe we can talk about that later. Okay, so what does this have to do with a real cell? Well, don't worry, I'm not going to argue that the cell is critical or, heaven forbid, self-organized so. But I am going to argue that it can take advantage of the ability to tune itself across a rigid floppy boundary by stresses alone. So this is actually from, this picture can help us understand the kinds of experiments that I'm showing here. This is from work from Mike Sheets' group a few years ago, where they took an adherent cell, which would then be under a lot of internal stress. So you should imagine that in a normal state, the cell is generating a lot of contractile stresses on its environment, certainly in this context at least. And what was done was to add a drug which interferes with that force generation, if you like, turning off the internal motor activity. And what happens is the system goes unstable in a way that at least one can begin to think about as crossing this boundary. Without any change, well, in these late stages, I'm not going to argue there has been no change, but at least in principle, without any change in the network structure or even connectivity. Yeah?
Could you just comment, because to some extent the motors also act as crosslinkers.
Yes, good point.
Yeah, could you just
absolutely, good point. So you're right. Every time motors bind to filaments, they also look like an elastic constraint. The effect that we observe, certainly in simulation, is that the effect of that motor activity is much greater than you can understand based on the connectivity alone. So if you like, that's a second order effect. It's subdominant. Okay, so what was done here, as I said, was to add a drug to suppress the force generation. Goes into a unstable state. They could wash the drug out, and actually the cell largely recovered. I'm not going to argue it's super happy, but and again, obviously many other things are happening here. The point is just that this simple picture of stress-induced transition from a floppy to a rigid state can help in understanding this sort of picture. They had argued in this paper for a more ordered actin structure which could give this effect. The point is that even a disordered network generically has this property. Forces tend to stabilize and can actually take you across this sort of, roughly speaking, solid fluid-like boundary. Okay. So these examples so far are examples of how one can have stability below the isostatic point. That's what I sort of started with as a question. I want to look at one more, and and if there's time, end with just some movies about marginal systems. So everything I've said so far is athermal. There's no temperature in anything I've talked about so far. So what happens when you add thermal fluctuations to this original Maxwell picture? Now, in view of time, I'm going to go a little quickly through this, but let me just point out there's actually been very little study of this over the years, partly because, as was sort of indicated in Tom's talk on Monday, a lot of the recent motivation for looking at isostatic systems has come from thinking about jammed particle packings. Those systems are athermal. In the context of these networks, they're, I would say, more thermal generally than those. So the idea here is to ask the question, what happens at finite temperature to this original picture here? Modulus as a function of conductivity. Well, I might expect to have a stable system as soon as I add temperature below the isostatic point. Here's a good way to think about that. Take a freely jointed chain. The freely jointed chain, well, sort of like a bicycle chain, at least if it's not in its extended state, is entirely floppy. As soon as you turn on temperature, however, that system goes rigid. You get an entropic elasticity. So you might imagine a similar thing would happen down here. The system is floppy. It has a lot of so-called floppy modes. Those get excited thermally, and you might get stable. One of the few studies of this, earlier studies of this I've indicated here from Michael Pliszka, and what they showed is that the system actually is stabilized between the conductivity percolation point, i.e. where you have a conducting path through the system, and the isostatic point at finite temperature. This is actually recent work from Matthew Dennison, who's sitting in the back of the room there in the group, who's looked at the thermal effects of these systems at and below the isostatic point. And you do indeed see, as you add temperature, so this is with increasing temperature, you get stability in a way that's very reminiscent of what bending did. And again, the rough analogy I want to make is with the what a magnetic field does in the case of a magnet.
This is ball and spring?
This is Hookean springs with finite rest length in a relaxed network with diluted bonds, and then turn on temperature. Allow the system to fluctuate. That's the basic idea. The interesting stuff, of course, is happening in the regime where it's floppy mechanically at 0 temperature. Now, this system is in fact critical. Yes?
Why
it's stable?
Why in the case for bending, it went stiffer and you stabilized it. Now you add temperature, and in my naive view, it's getting more.
It stiffens.
So why does more temperature stiffen?
Take the entropic spring. You get a spring constant proportional to temperature.
Oh, because it's more entropy.
Yeah. Well, it's T multiplying the
P, but the free energy is T multiplied.
Yeah, it's T multiplying an entropy term. And if the entropy is geometric, as it will not turn out to be here, by the way, in a 2D random network, but if the entropy is geometric, then the derivative of the free energy with strain is just some number times T. Okay, so indeed, this system shows the same hallmarks of critical behavior. Interestingly, without showing the usual entropic elasticity at low temperatures where the shear modulus goes proportional with T. It actually goes sublinearly with the exponent of approximately 0.8. Now, we don't have a good mean field understanding of that, let alone anything beyond mean field. However, it does make sense if you think about temperature as generating a stress in the system, as it is observed to do. It's a sort of pressure, negative pressure. The system wants to collapse, much like the freely jointed chain. And then the anomalous stress dependence I mentioned before actually look very similar to this. But what's probably most striking is the square root of t behavior near the critical point. So the system actually develops a broad regime, it turns out, as a function of temperature, where the temperature dependence of the shear modulus is anomalous, specifically near the critical point with the square root behavior. So you have athermal mechanical systems when they're highly connected at low temperature. You have a critical regime, a sort of entropic elasticity, but with anomalous temperature dependence. And if you crank temperature up, everything becomes proportional to temperature in the end, because of course it just starts behaving like a random gas, a ideal gas, but with mechanical connections in it.
This temperature can be also an effective temperature.
Well, yeah, interesting point. So you could imagine that athermal fluctuations will do a similar thing. I think one should be careful with drawing the immediate analogy between real temperature and an effective temperature, however, because it's known, for instance, that activity can give rise to time dependence, for instance, which is completely different from thermal fluctuations. So qualitatively, yes, but I would be careful drawing that analogy directly. Okay? Okay, I think I should end very soon, right? Oh, okay. So let me just show one last thing about coming from a highly connected state and approaching this marginal point in a way that motors actually do in these biopolymer networks. So they actually generate this marginal state from the highly connected state. So this is actually from a collaboration with Gijs Kundering's group. The work of experimental part of it is going to be from Jose Alvarado. And it's motivated in part by these kinds of results. This happens to be from an in vivo system by the movies of which I like, and from Ed Monroe's lab. But similar things have been done recently, including in Andreas's group, looking at how contractile motor activity leads to instabilities in networks and starts ripping them apart internally. Interestingly, either giving rise to a non-equilibrium steady state, as this picture these movies show, or leading to a sort of irreversible collapse of the network. Now, this happens to show in detail, it's the same cell, but what's shown here is myosin in the upper picture, actin in the upper movie and myosin in the lower. So what that corresponds to, of course, is this is an image where the network is fluorescently labeled and below the motors are fluorescently labeled. So what happens is not only do motors give rise to contraction that you can sort of see in this network, but the motors cluster. So you can think of the motors as not only bringing the actin together, but the actin, the filaments, mediating interactions between the myosin. Works both ways. And so the basic idea here is the following. The idea I want to start off with, sort of theoretically, if you like, is to look at what happens as a function of connectivity. So this black point now is the isostatic point. We have a highly connected network on the right. And if you were to add stress to that, i.e. start pulling on that network, what will happen, at least at low force, well, what you might imagine is it'll rupture. And you might get something like fracture. I'll show you an image of that, or a movie of that in a moment. But basically, it would be, at low force, it would be stable over here. And of course, over here, it would just fall apart because it's floppy to begin with. So if you think about how it falls apart, though, it would separate into domains corresponding to connected clusters. And within the percolation picture, those clusters would grow in size, or have an actual distribution, which becomes a power law, at this critical point. But I would get large clusters of many different sizes near this point. Now, What that suggests is, well, I can't reverse it now. Anyway, what that suggests is that, so I know it's distracting, but don't look at the movie for just a second. So what that suggests is that these domains grow, but right in a narrow range associated with the critical point. However, if you have motor activity that starts reducing the connectivity in the network, then you can imagine that you could start with a higher connectivity and drive the system to the same critical point. So that suggests that you would see this critical behavior over a broader regime.
Are you saying that the motors actually break?
So the evidence is that it seems that the motors are actually ripping crosslinks apart. I mean, off the filaments. So now let me show you the movies. Let's see, can I reverse this one? Yes. Okay, so this corresponds to a weakly connected structure. And what this is actually is just a sample chamber with actin and myosin. Myosin is generating contraction of actin into small domains of no particularly big size, and not even with a big wide distribution. Whereas here you see a range of domains of different sizes. In fact, the distribution here is that of a power law, and the domains can be basically as large as you like. Interestingly, though, ordinarily critical points are hard to reach, right? You have to tune parameters to get close to a critical point to see this kind of behavior. One of the striking things in these experiments that led us to think about this is the fact that this was the generic behavior they saw over a broad range of parameters. And what happens is motor activity takes even systems initially away from that critical point, breaks them down to a system which then falls apart as this system does here over a broad range of initial parameters. Finally, let me just show you what the corresponding image for something like Griffith's fracture would be, and I'll end there. You get just macroscopic ripping of the sample. That's if you go to very high connectivity. Eventually, if the stresses exceed a threshold, it will rip apart. So the basic idea here is you have something like Griffith's fracture here, and in a broad regime of initial parameters, a sort of fracturing into a very broad distribution of domain sizes, if you like, something like the shattering of glass into shards of many different sizes. So, well, hopefully what I've done is at least convince you that this marginal point is interesting. It's interesting mechanically, partly because it is so responsive, corresponding to diverging susceptibility, for instance. It also, this kind of activity has been the inspiration for trying to think about making new materials. So we've actually, in collaboration with people like Vincenzo in the back of the room, and colleagues in Leiden and Amsterdam and Eindhoven, we've formed a consortium to basically start trying to create structures exploiting these interesting mechanical properties, the marginal point. I didn't at all get into non-equilibrium activity or fluctuations, although that certainly relates to your question, Len. And finally, these systems also have interesting slow relaxation, which can be quite fun to look at. But I think I should end there, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, it's a little late, but obvious for me to stop people from asking questions.
How do you define the connectivity for long filaments? Is it the connectivity of a crosslinks, or is it the number of filaments which are crosslinked to a given one? An actin filament and many, many other filaments.
Yeah.
So which number should I use?
So both are important, unfortunately, is the answer. There's not a simple answer. So for instance, if you have mechanically rigid objects, it's not surprising that if you cross-link the same filament multiple times, that's very different from having the same cross-links between filaments spread more. Yeah, so it's actually one reason why molecular weight alone, or the number of cross-links per filament alone, can actually also stabilize networks, even with the same microscopic parameters.
But when you made the argument that you can think of a cross-linked filamentous system as having a Z of 4, you were doing the counting where you just looked at each individual link.
You're right. I started with just simply the Hookean spring picture.
Can I ask another one?
I'll come back to you, but let Phil give us questions. Yeah. Okay.
Could you translate some of your critical phenomena formulas into stress? Stress is a function of strain and temperature relation in the spirit of thermoelasticity.
Okay, so I didn't actually explicitly look at strain. So it turns out these systems, not too surprisingly, are highly nonlinear. Certainly, if you're starting with a system which has 0 modulus to begin with, and you put it under strain and it stabilizes, that's a highly nonlinear situation, a very singularly nonlinear situation. You want to look at, I think that might actually be an interesting discussion for later. I don't have a good answer for you, though.
Just that some of the phenomena you're showing suggest phase transitions. And that's
it certainly is.
Naturally modeled with structures.
Okay. Anybody else? John Fitzwater.
Can I come back to your first point that rigid polymers are very different from flexible polymers? Why wouldn't I
You're going to disagree with me? Oh.
Why wouldn't I apply your whole story to flexible polymers? Always above.
Good point. Good point.
Have all kind of non-affine deformations and.
Okay, that's actually a very interesting story. So it turns out a naive rubber is, of course, subisostatic. Why should it be stable? Well, so this is precisely the sort of thing Shlomo and others have been, and not only them, but they've been interested in. But the thing is, you can't understand the naive. Take a naive picture of entropic chains between network nodes. Make a network structure out of that. It's subisostatic. It shouldn't be stable. You have to take into account the solvent interaction and the swelling of that network. Now, that swelling looks like a stress, right?
Yes, but wouldn't that exist for actin as well?
Yeah, it will, but generally, because they're so rigid to bending, solvent interaction is less important. And also things like, so it's what's the term I'm looking for? Basically, the concentrations involved are very low, and their stability is coming from other things like bending. So the solvent effects are subdominant, I would say.
Okay, let's thank Fred again. And